Hello there, welcome to Write Better Stories. My name is Daniel Backer and this is my son Lawrence. And today we're going to talk about a concept called the anticipation of action. But before we do that, let's talk about me and Lawrence. So yeah, I've had a pretty good week. I ended up going to that wig party like I said I was going to, and I didn't drink any alcohol like I said. And it was nice because I was able to get up the next day and write without any pain or hangover. And Lawrence has been really good. He has just been chattering away, especially whenever I'm trying to focus on anything. It's like he's super silent whenever I give him attention, but then whenever I'm trying to focus on anything, he starts to monologue. So I guess I shouldn't be surprised. Also, Lawrence really likes it when I talk directly into his face like this. I think that he got this from putting his ear up to my phone when I'm playing podcasts. He likes that vibration, and so now I'm starting to think that he's just using me. But anyway, let's talk about this concept called the anticipation of action. This is a vital concept to any script or story, but a lot of people don't necessarily think of it that way. And technically what the anticipation of action is the idea of suspense. Now, you've obviously heard of suspense before, but the thing about suspense is it kind of gives you this idea of more of a genre or a feeling within a horror film. It doesn't really explain itself quite as well until you hear it as the anticipation of action. At least that's how I was. I had never really heard it put that way, but then once I did, and once I started trying to implement it into my scenes and in my writing and in my stories, I really started to understand how important this is and how it can solve so many different problems for you. So if you've ever gotten the note before that you have a scene in your story that just doesn't really make sense, like why that's even there, maybe you just wanted to put this cool idea in it, it probably means that this was not an anticipated scene. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to make it so that your audience can completely predict everything that's going to happen, but what you can do is you can add the anticipation of action in order to smooth out those sort of awkward jumps within your story. Now, another thing that the anticipation of action can help you do is help with the problem of too much exposition. This is definitely a problem that plenty of people get and a very common note, and it can be solved very easily. And I really get the inclination. I think a lot of this comes from, too, is people who read a lot of novels, because novels do kind of lend themselves to having long passages of description and backstory, and that's definitely allowed, but I think a lot of people don't consider, too, that novels are full of scenes as well. It's easy to kind of gloss over that just since it's all text, and you can kind of blur the line to yourself of what is summary and what is scenic, but you really want to make sure that you don't put in only exposition within your thing. Now, for a script or a movie, this is much more obvious. You can kind of tell as a viewer when you're being pandered to, or when they're just trying to force feed all of this backstory for you so they can get their story going, or even beyond exposition, if they're just trying to telegraph the theme to you and really let you know what's going on, this usually makes for a weaker story. So I'm sure there are examples of it that we can find in good books and good movies, but for the most part, it actually helps to be a little bit more mysterious and let your audience make guesses and, like I said, anticipate future action happening rather than just telling them everything right off of the bat. And like I said, it can smooth over those awkward moments in your story. So let's get into it a little bit more concretely. Probably the most necessary way to implement the anticipation of action is in what a lot of people call a call to action within a story. This is usually a moment when you tell the audience or the reader, hey, this is what the story is going to be about. Now, I'm going to attach a caveat to this, and that's basically why I don't necessarily call it the call to action, but rather the anticipation of action, because not all stories have these. I think especially more like literary books, it's not clear that you pick up The Great Gatsby and it's just about one thing. You know, it's kind of a survey of a societal landscape and maybe the interior of a character. So it's not too easy to say that it's just about one thing versus, say, the movie Hot Rod. And forgive me if I have the details kind of scrambled, but to my understanding, the call to action in that movie is that Andy Samberg's character decides that he is going to become a stuntman in order to earn the respect of his father or stepfather. Something like that, right? So that's a pretty clear, tangible thing. And again, comparing that to The Great Gatsby, you don't necessarily get that thing. But talking more about this idea of call to action within a maybe more straightforward context can help demystify the concept to you, and then we can apply it to those more non-linear narratives that don't necessarily have that one goal that they're trying to achieve. So we'll get to those in a second. But just a few examples of this call to action and the anticipation of action in some other stories. We'll take Harry Potter. You know, that's a pretty common story that a lot of people have either read the book series or watched the movies. And just in the first one, I'm not going to get too detailed in it just in case you haven't seen it in a while or read it in a while, but a pretty fair call to action in the first book is when Harry gets a letter from Hogwarts that he's a wizard and he's going to go join Hogwarts. That would be pretty foolish if the story ended right there, right? The reason for that is that you're anticipating more things happening. He gets a letter from Hogwarts, and now you know, you can kind of have an idea, you can forecast that they're going to go explore that. You know, they're probably not just going to drop that there. Now, obviously, there are some stories that they'll give you something and they'll kind of whip you in another direction in order to surprise you, and that's definitely allowed too. But this idea of the anticipation of action within the call to action is basically just the concept that they kind of leave you hanging and then answer that with the rest of the story. So another really good example of these that are very clear and kind of hard to miss are in detective stories or noirs. That at the beginning of the story, usually somebody comes into the detective's office and gives him a mystery to solve, you know? And again, that would be pretty ridiculous if they were like, the end of the story is they walked out of the office and the detective didn't do anything. He didn't follow the case, right? So we can just tell, based on the beginning of that story, that there's going to be more action that happens. They're going to try to crack the case. They're going to try to pursue this mystery, whatever it might be. So some examples of that specifically are in The Big Sleep and The Big Lebowski, which are actually sort of interconnected because The Big Lebowski was based on The Big Sleep, the movie, which is based on the book. But in both cases, you have this thing at the beginning that basically demands further explanation and further exploration. So those are pretty clear examples. I just want to give you a couple more just to really drive this home. In Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Charlie gets a golden ticket to go to the chocolate factory. Now, it's not necessarily much of a mystery, but it does leave you hanging, and it does leave you eager to know, how does it look when he goes to the chocolate factory? What happens when he gets there? We anticipate that there is going to be follow-up to that idea of him getting this golden ticket at the chocolate factory. We can also look at this in Finding Nemo. Nemo disappears. We got to find him, right? You have to answer that question, okay? In Toy Story, Buzz Lightyear shows up and Woody's super jealous. Let's explore it. You know, these are things that sort of demand investigation, and as a viewer, you're expecting more things to happen. And so if you are writing a story that does have a more clear call to action like this, it can really help just solidify everything in your story and give you a really clear test for whether or not your scenes actually belong in the story. You can look at it and be like, does this scene have anything to do with my call to action whatsoever, of them achieving this goal that they set out for? And maybe it doesn't, and it's just fun, and you want to keep it in there. Hey, more power to you. But the thing is, you really want to solidify all of these things in order to give you that structure for yourself and make sure that your story is coherent and clear. Now, like I said, not every story is like this, and in fact, some of my favorite stories, specifically in books, don't necessarily have that one call to action that basically guides and makes the entire story cohere into like a singular thing. So in this case, we still have this idea of the anticipation of action. However, it's not necessarily guided toward any one particular goal. It's just a way of tying the scenes together, in my opinion. And in fact, I think that this is something that you should really consider if you do like writing those less clear, more abstract stories that I definitely like to write and I definitely like to read. So basically, what you want to do is, at the end of every scene, you want to give your audience something further to look forward to, right? It's very similar to the call to action, except it doesn't necessarily unite the entire story. It just is a way of making the audience want to keep on reading. And so this can, I think, have a lot more to do with the characters' relationships and that sort of thing. So an example that I'm going to make up right now that I think would definitely give you this idea of a call to action, or I'm sorry, the anticipation of action within the story rather than at the beginning as a call to action, is if two characters are having an affair and then one of their actual spouses comes in and catches them and then runs out of the room crying. Can we end the story there? Probably not. You know, that would be pretty unsatisfying as a viewer if you have two of the main characters having an affair with each other and then one of their spouses catches them and then runs away crying. Like, we can assume there has to be some fallout and some investigation, exploration. We got to answer those questions. What happens? What are the consequences? You know? So I think that's a good way of thinking of some of this anticipation of action too, is this idea of consequences, which is very tied in to the idea of character action, that you know your character actions are strong when you can forecast as a writer another scene to address the fallout of the last scene that happened. If they have those impactful consequences, then we can really say that you have some good anticipation of action there. So I'm going to keep hammering on this point home too, because like I said, this really opened a door for me in my writing and for plotting, because I was one of those guys that would read a lot of the technical structural books, and they were very inspiring, but I always felt like they were a little too technical and it was too much of a grid that I was just trying to fill in, and like a Mad Lib almost. And that's definitely what I don't think story writing should be. I've talked about before this idea of discovery within your story. And so I think it's much more in line with discovery if you can sort of leave those grids and leave those structures behind and sort of develop a structure for yourself. However, you don't want to just completely freewheel and just write whatever you want, or else you're going to write a bunch of stuff that doesn't really fit necessarily. So one of those things that can really focus your story and give you sort of a internally imposed structure rather than an externally imposed structure is that idea of action and the anticipation of action. So let's see if we can think of some more examples right now. If there is a bully who says, hey, we're going to meet after school and we're going to fight, and then the story ends. Terrible, right? Yeah, you need to have that fight or something. Maybe the guy runs away. That's allowed too. It can be a left turn. It doesn't have to directly answer that mystery or question that you raised in the last scene, but it just makes everything a little bit more coherent. So let's see if we can maybe look at The Great Gatsby a little bit closer too, because this is, like I said, one that doesn't necessarily have any one specific goal, but you know what, maybe we shouldn't look at The Great Gatsby because I haven't read that in a really long time. Sorry about that. But maybe in Warlock, the one that I'm reading right now, I think one of the best examples of anticipation of action in this book is basically these four cowboys get accused of killing this guy, and they are acquitted in court, but the citizens community says that if they're acquitted, then the marshal has to basically run them out of town or kill them. As we can imagine, this gives us a lot of anticipation of action. That's an enormous threat. So if the story carried on and made no reference to that after the fact, that would be a pretty big misstep. But luckily, Warlock, like I said, is a really good example of a story that utilizes a lot of the concepts that I'm talking about in these videos. And this is a good example, too, of a more literary, sprawling, not necessarily just like a straightforward, hey, we have to win the race. It's nothing like that. There's no clear end point. However, from scene to scene, there are great examples of character action that have consequences that make you anticipate more scenes down the line. Another good example from Warlock is there's this doctor that is in love with this caretaker who takes care of all of the miners, and the caretaker begins to mention that she's in love with the new marshal. So we've got a little love triangle. But in that scene, he just kind of infers that she's attracted to him. And then a little bit later in the story, they get together. So this is a perfect example of this. And they don't necessarily have to give everything away right there. Like in that one scene, she doesn't have to be like, I'm in love with him and now we're together and everything like that. This is a way of sort of pacing everything out and not completely giving away all of that right in the beginning. Again, there's a million examples within Warlock. In maybe to deviate from the literary examples and to get back to more straightforward examples again, Ocean's 11, they literally make a plan to do a heist. As a viewer, you're like, all right, this movie better have a heist in it, and obviously it does. But as a writer, sometimes it can be so confusing because you're sitting there being like, oh, I don't know what scene to write next. Well, look back on the scenes that you've already written. What do those scenes promise to the audience? Do they make any promises? Are there promises that you can make within those scenes that then you can later draft scenes for that answer those promises? This is a way to flesh out something that's just a tiny idea and really turn it into something that's a little bit longer. Or it's a way to look at your scene and be like, maybe this isn't even an entire scene. Maybe this is just a little gist. So maybe it would be helpful here if we talked about the concept of just what a scene is. By the way, because I know earlier I talked about the difference between summary and scene, but I didn't necessarily get into detail about what those are. So typically this is probably better fitted to novels. However, there is an analog for scripts as well. But within fiction in particular, summary would be anything that's more of like a broad view over everything, that's just giving you the overall gist of everything. It's not two people in a room in real time affecting each other. It's more of a backstory. It's description of the environment. It's backstory. I might have already said that. Maybe I'm reaching, but yeah, it's basically anything other than a scene that you would find within a short story or a book. Now, what a scene is kind of what I already said. It's two people at least in a room affecting each other. Are there examples of one-person scenes? Yes. Are there examples of no-person scenes? Yes. You can have a little mouse running across the ground and something happens. That's allowed. However, if you are trying to write a story that's going to be of any considerable length, you need to have two people at least in a room that are having an interaction. This makes me think of a lot of the experiences that I had in my creative writing program during my English major. And we had this teacher who was kind of a dick, and it was actually very helpful because he would not be nice at all in his critiques. And sometimes that's just what you need to hear, you know. And some of the critiques that he would give to people would be like, you guys need to put two people in a room and make them affect each other. That's what a story is. And now I think people in our generation are like, no, it's whatever you want it to be. And sure, but at the very least, anything that somebody's going to want to read or watch on a TV screen, put two people in a room and have them affect each other. Now, a lot of people here too maybe get caught up in their heads about, oh, but I need dialogue. What makes good dialogue? Well, it can be helpful to start out by saying what is not good dialogue. People just like shooting the shit, it's probably not good dialogue. And I immediately think of like Quentin Tarantino, where it appears that they're just shooting the shit, but I would argue in a lot of his scenes, specifically like the John Travolta, Samuel L. Jackson scene in Pulp Fiction, even though they're just kind of jib-jabbing, it does give you a pretty good idea of who these characters are too. So especially in the beginning of a story, I think you can get away with more small talk and that kind of thing, but you don't want to have too many scenes where the characters are just sitting down and being like, hey, how's it going? Oh, pretty good, nothing. Oh, I just did some laundry. Yeah. It's not worth it, okay? Cut to the meat of an interaction where one person says something and the other person has a reaction to it. Now, this gets back to that concept of emotional choices and characters that I mentioned in my character video, so watch that if you haven't yet, pretty please. But yeah, you want to have these characters having emotional moments that basically make them, or they're having reactions to each other, they're affecting each other. So if we can think of a good example, let's take Toy Story. When Buzz sort of shows off and he jumps into the air and gets caught on the fan and like spins around and he falls and he was like, hey, I'm flying. And then Woody is like, flying? That was falling with style. You know, this is a pretty good example of a really good scene because it's really less about the things that they're saying and more about this dynamic that's going on there. We can see that Woody is pretty jealous and he's trying to take Buzz down, knock him down a peg, and yeah, basically he's seeing his power as the former cool guy sort of dissipate as this new space guy comes here. And so that would be the sort of the meat of that scene. However, those two characters interacting with each other, that gives you the scene, but really what you want to have, especially at the end of the scene, is some sort of anticipation of action, which is the point of this entire video. So have two characters at least, put them in a room, make them affect each other, and end the scene with some sort of expectation of more things to follow. I'm done. I can't talk anymore about this. I think you can tell I'm completely dry. Lawrence is getting tired. He wants me to talk into his face a little bit more. So please leave some comments and questions if you have any of those. Like and subscribe, and hopefully this will help you write better stories. Thank you. Bye.